Al Capone ruled Chicago with fear and headlines. Lucky Luciano stitched together New York with invisible strings of power. But far above the noise of downtown Manhattan, in the narrow streets of Harlem, there was a different kind of ruler, a man whose name never needed to be shouted because everyone already knew it. Ellsworth Raymond Johnson, better known as Bumpy, a name spoken carefully, a name that opened doors and closed mouths. In an America built on segregation and silent rules, where power was never meant to rest in black hands, one man rewrote the script without asking permission. He didn't wear a crown, didn't sit in marble offices, but if you wanted to run numbers, open a speakeasy, move money, or even keep the police off your back in Harlem, you went through Bumpy Johnson, or you didn't go at all. Politicians whispered his name behind closed doors. Police negotiated instead of arresting, and the Italian Mafia, the most feared criminal organization in the country, learned very quickly that Harlem was not theirs to take. Not because Bumpy was the loudest or the strongest, but because he understood something deeper. Power is not seized in chaos. It is built patiently, quietly, and defended without hesitation. To the people of Harlem, he was protection. To his enemies, he was a problem that never went away. To history, he became an anomaly, a black man who rose to the absolute top of a racist underworld that was designed to crush him before he ever began. But this power did not come from privilege or opportunity. It came from hunger, from loss, from blood spilled in streets that never made the newspapers. This is not a story about a gangster chasing money. This is a story about a man who learned how the system worked, and then turned it against itself. Because behind the tailored suits and quiet intelligence was a life marked by war, betrayal by those closest to him. Years spent behind bars designed to erase men like him, and a legacy that still divides Harlem to this day. Some called him a criminal. Others called him a protector. Many called him a king, but no one ever called him weak. And before he became the man who stood eye to eye with mafia bosses, before Harlem bent to his will, before his name carried weight in rooms he was never supposed to enter, Bumpy Johnson was just another black boy born into a world that expected nothing from him. And that is where this story truly begins. Because power like this is never given. It is taken. Bumpy Johnson was born on October 31st, 1905, in Charleston, South Carolina, a place where the rules of life were written clearly and cruelly in black and white. The world he entered was segregated by law, enforced by fear, and maintained by violence that rarely needed witnesses to be effective. His family was modest, religious, and respected within their black community, yet no amount of respect could protect them from the reality that their lives were considered disposable beyond the boundaries of their neighborhood. Bumpy was intelligent from an early age, talkative, curious, and sharp enough to skip grades in school, but intelligence offered no shield against hatred in the Jim Crow South. Even as a child, he sensed that the world around him was dangerous in ways adults did not always explain out loud. He watched grown men lower their voices when white people passed by, watched his parents choose silence over pride, and learned early that survival often meant restraint. But restraint was not in Bumpy's nature. The defining fracture in his childhood came when his older brother Willie, only 19 years old, was accused of killing a white man. In South Carolina, an accusation alone was often a death sentence for a black man, and everyone in the Johnson family knew it. Their fear was not abstract or exaggerated because they had seen what happened to men accused of crossing invisible racial lines. Just years earlier, a young black man named Kit Bookhart had been lynched not far from their home, tortured in ways too brutal to describe without understanding the message behind them. He was scalped, mutilated, blinded, and thrown into a river while still alive, not as punishment, but as a warning. No one was ever arrested. No one was ever questioned. Justice was not delayed because justice was never intended. That story burned itself into young Bumpy's mind, teaching him a lesson no classroom ever could. In this world, innocence meant nothing, truth meant nothing, and being black meant living one accusation away from death. So when Willie came home in fear, the family did not wait to argue or investigate because hesitation could cost a life. They acted the only way black families knew how to act in moments like this. They sent Willie away, north. Somewhere the rules were different, or at least hidden better. That same decision would soon be made for Bumpy himself. His mother was already working in New York, chasing opportunity while carrying guilt for the distance it created at home. When it became clear that Charleston could not protect him, Bumpy was put on a train bound for Harlem. He was 14 years old, small for his age, emotionally hardened far beyond it, carrying more anger than luggage. He did not leave the South chasing dreams or adventure. He left because staying meant learning to live on his knees. And Bumpy Johnson had already decided long before he reached Harlem that he would never bow to a world built to break him. Harlem did not greet Bumpy Johnson with opportunity or comfort. It greeted him with noise, dice on sidewalks, men watching from corners, and an unspoken rule that weakness was collected like rent. He was 14 years old when he arrived, small for his age, narrow-shouldered, and easy to underestimate, but his eyes carried something most men twice his size did not: awareness. He understood immediately that Harlem was not simply a neighborhood, it was a proving ground, and every block demanded payment in either fear or respect. On his very first day walking to school, just 2 blocks from the door, he crossed paths with a group of teenagers shooting dice against a building, laughter sharp, money changing hands fast. Someone grabbed his arm and called him country, asked what he had in his pockets, tested him the way predators test unfamiliar prey. Bumpy did not pull away. He did not apologize. He warned them. He told them that if he took his hand out of his pocket, someone was going to regret it. When the first punch came, it missed, and that miss changed everything. Bumpy moved faster than anyone expected, snapping forward with a precision that had nothing to do with size and everything to do with intent. His fist broke a nose, blood sprayed, and coins spilled from his hand, revealing he had been fighting dirty, using loose change to turn his punches into weapons. The crowd screamed, bets changed mid-fight, and in seconds, the boy who was supposed to teach Bumpy a lesson was broken on the pavement. That fight traveled faster than Bumpy ever could, and by the end of the day, his name had weight on the block. That was where he met Nat, Finley, and Junie, boys who recognized immediately that what they had witnessed was not luck, but something rare. From that day forward, they moved together, not as kids pretending to be men, but as a unit forming in real time. Bumpy never went back to school after that morning, and when his sister asked why, he did not give excuses because Harlem had already educated him. School taught theory, but the streets taught consequence. He learned how money flowed, who paid who lied, and who watched from the shadows. They hustled first, shining shoes, sweeping storefronts, selling newspapers, but Bumpy quickly saw what others missed. The store owners were afraid, and fear was a currency more reliable than cash. He offered protection before anyone asked, and soon people paid not because he demanded it, but because trouble stopped following their doors. That was his first taste of real power, the kind that does not announce itself, but settles quietly into routine. Bumpy did not yell. He did not posture. He simply stood where he was not supposed to stand and stayed there. Word spread that if Bumpy was watching your store, nothing happened to it, and if something did happen, it stopped permanently. He was the brains of the group, the planner, the one who thought 2 moves ahead even then, and his friends followed not out of fear, but certainty. Harlem noticed, men older than him noticed, and one of them, a violent enforcer named Bub Huet, would soon test whether this boy from South Carolina was a temporary spark. or something far more dangerous. In Harlem, there were men who talked tough, and then there were men whose presence alone ended conversations, and Bub Hewitt belonged to the second category. Bub was feared not because he bragged, but because everyone knew what he carried and how easily he used it. A knife, a bat, sometimes a gun, always close enough to remind people that hesitation could cost them everything. He was older, taller, built like a wall, and made his living extorting businesses that needed protection from problems he often created himself. When a new grocery store opened on 7th Avenue, Bub arrived the way he always did, confident that fear would do the negotiating for him. But instead of a nervous owner reaching for cash, he was pointed toward a teenage boy leaning casually against a black Lincoln outside, arms crossed, eyes locked on him. That boy was Bumpy Johnson. Bub laughed at first, assuming it was a joke, until Bumpy told him calmly to get off his car and off his block. In Harlem, words like that usually ended with someone bleeding, but what stopped Bub was not Bumpy's size, it was his certainty. There was no shaking in his voice, no need to explain himself, no attempt to back down. Bub could have ended the situation with a single punch, but instinct told him something different. This boy was not reckless. He was calculated. Instead of breaking him, Bub did something unexpected. He partnered with him. In that moment, Bumpy crossed an invisible line from street kid to apprentice, learning the mechanics of real power from a man who understood violence better than most. Under Bub's guidance, the hustles became organized, structured, and profitable. Protection rackets expanded beyond groceries into clubs, speakeasies, and businesses that moved serious money. Bumpy learned that control was not about constant force, but about consistency, reputation, and knowing when to act and when to wait. When Bub suggested they move into protecting illegal lottery operations, Bumpy immediately saw the scale of what that meant. The numbers game was feeding entire neighborhoods, and anyone who controlled it controlled Harlem's bloodstream. Bumpy proved quickly that he was not just muscle, but strategy. He handled disputes, calmed owners, intimidated rivals without unnecessary bloodshed, and built trust where fear alone would have failed. His name began circulating far beyond his age, whispered by people who didn't know where he came from, only that he solved problems permanently. By the time Bub realized it, Bumpy was no longer learning. He was becoming essential, a man others relied on, a man whose absence created chaos, a man whose presence brought order to an illegal world that depended on stability. Harlem had seen plenty of violent men before. What it had not seen was a young black man who understood that true power wasn't taken loudly. It was accumulated patiently. And this reputation would soon bring Bumpy to the attention of someone far more dangerous than Bub Hewitt, a woman who ruled Harlem's gambling empire, and a war that would test everything Bumpy Johnson had learned so far. By the time Bumpy Johnson's name began circulating through Harlem's back rooms and storefronts, it inevitably reached the ears of the woman who truly ruled the neighborhood's most profitable secret. Stephanie St. Clair, elegant, fearless, and unapologetically black in a criminal world dominated by white men, she had built an empire on the numbers game, a lottery for the poor that quietly generated millions while feeding entire families and funding entire blocks. She dressed with class, spoke with precision, and fought with a fury that shocked men who assumed power came with gender or skin color. When she hired Bumpy as her bodyguard, it was not just for muscle, but for his mind. He stood beside her in meetings, watched how she moved money, how she challenged police corruption openly in court, and how she understood that Harlem's greatest weapon was unity. Under her protection and guidance, Bumpy transformed from an enforcer into a strategist, a man who could anticipate threats before they arrived and counter them without panic. But Harlem's prosperity did not go unnoticed. South of Harlem, in the Bronx, a man named Dutch Schultz was watching closely. Violent, paranoid, and fueled by rage, Schultz had lost his alcohol empire with the end of Prohibition and was hunting for new blood. The numbers game offered exactly what he needed. Cash without taxes, customers without banks, and desperation he could exploit. The numbers game was simple but irresistible. A dollar bet promised 600 in return, a miracle to people earning $10 or $15 a week during the Great Depression. By the early 1930s, Harlem's lottery was generating more than $50 million a year, an amount so massive it rivaled legitimate industries and embarrassed the system meant to regulate them. Schultz sent his men north, not to negotiate, but to intimidate. He promised protection from police, protection from kidnappings, protection from problems his own crew manufactured behind the scenes. Some operators folded immediately, others were beaten, some disappeared. St. Clair refused to bend. She knew what surrender meant, not just for her, but for Harlem itself. A white gangster extracting wealth from a black neighborhood already stripped of opportunity was not business, it was theft. The streets began to change. Drive-by shootings replaced warnings. Enforcers were attacked in daylight. Loyalty was tested with fists and bullets. Bumpy watched it all with growing resolve, understanding that this was no longer about money alone. It was about control, about whether Harlem would be owned or governed. Schultz's reputation made the threat real. This was a man who tortured for pleasure, who answered defiance with mutilation, who believed fear was more efficient than persuasion. The pressure mounted daily, and even the strongest among St. Clair's allies began to question survival. But Bumpy did not waver. He saw in this conflict the same injustice he had witnessed as a child in South Carolina, only now the battlefield was economic instead of physical. Harlem was being invaded, not by law, but by power. And power only respects resistance. The violence escalated until there was no longer any space for compromise. No quiet corner left untouched. No illusion that this could end peacefully. Harlem stood at the edge of a war that would decide who truly ruled its streets. And at the center of that storm stood Bumpy Johnson, no longer a bodyguard, no longer an apprentice, but a man preparing to choose a side that would define the rest of his life. When Bumpy Johnson stepped back onto the streets of Harlem after prison, he did not return as a boy looking for opportunity. He returned as a man carrying unfinished business. The neighborhood had changed while he was gone, but the tension in the air felt familiar, heavier, sharper, like a storm that had been waiting for his return. It took only 2 days for word to reach him that the balance of power was shifting, and that the question everyone was asking was not whether a war was coming, but whose side Bumpy Johnson would stand on when it arrived. Dutch Schultz's people wasted no time. Through old connections and familiar faces, the offer was delivered plainly, stripped of sentiment, money every week, authority under a larger empire, protection backed by white power and political insulation. It was the smart move, the safe move, the move most men in his position would have taken without hesitation. Schultz controlled violence with scale, had endless soldiers, endless resources, and no moral hesitation. Standing against him meant isolation. Standing with him meant survival. But survival had never been enough for Bumpy. When he met with Stephanie St. Clair, there was no negotiation, only urgency. Her empire was under siege, her people beaten, her operations shrinking by the day. She did not beg. She demanded loyalty, the way only someone who had already risked everything could. She spoke not just of money lost, but of dignity stolen, of Harlem being stripped piece by men who had never lived there, never suffered there, never belonged there. Bumpy listened quietly, weighing not just outcomes, but meaning. He knew what siding with Schultz would bring: power without resistance, comfort without purpose, and he knew what standing with St. Clair meant as well: blood, fear, loss, possibly death. When Bub Huet approached him later, acting as Schultz's messenger, the moment crystallized. Bub spoke of guarantees, of structure, of future control under a white syndicate that already ruled most of New York. Bumpy let him finish, then spoke words that would echo through Harlem long after the war was over. He said he could never side with a white man over black people, not in business, not in power, not in life. It was not bravado, it was identity. With that sentence, Bumpy severed the option of retreat. He chose Harlem, not as territory, but as responsibility. From that moment on, he was no longer a player navigating the system. He was a symbol challenging it. He understood exactly what he was declaring. War without equal numbers. War without institutional backing. War fought block by block against men who did not need to blend in because they believed fear alone was enough. But Harlem was different. Bumpy and his crew moved through it unseen, unremarkable, indistinguishable from the people Schultz's men were exploiting. That was their advantage. The war did not begin with headlines or public declarations. It began quietly. A beating here, a message delivered there, an enforcer disappearing into an alley and never returning the same. Guerrilla tactics replaced brute force. Patience replaced panic. Bumpy became the planner, mapping retaliation instead of reacting to it. His old friends returned to his side, not because they were ordered to, but because loyalty had been forged long before money entered the equation. Nat became the executioner, Junie the strategist, and Bumpy the mind holding it all together. Harlem watched closely. Some were terrified, some were inspired. Everyone understood that a line had been crossed. This was no longer a dispute between criminals. It was a battle over who had the right to control black wealth in a black neighborhood. And once that kind of war begins, there is no victory without sacrifice, no peace without blood, and no turning back for the man who chose to stand in the middle of it. The war did not arrive with sirens or speeches. It crept into Harlem like a sickness, spreading block by block, alley by alley, until violence became part of the neighborhood's daily rhythm. Bumpy Johnson understood immediately that this was not a war he could win with numbers because Dutch Schultz had more men, more guns, and more money than Harlem could ever match. So he fought differently. He fought invisibly. His crew blended into the streets they had grown up on. Men Schultz's soldiers walked past every day without noticing until it was too late. Enforcers were jumped in stairwells, beaten in doorways, ambushed while collecting money they would never finish counting. No warnings were given, no signatures left behind, only fear and uncertainty spreading through Schultz's ranks. The rivalry between Bumpy and Bub Huet burned hottest of all, because history sat between them like unfinished business. They clashed repeatedly, neither willing to back down, neither able to gain the upper hand, until fate intervened in the only way it ever does in criminal wars. Bub was arrested on an unrelated charge and sentenced to prison, ripping the spine out of Schultz's Harlem operation. Most of Bub's men disappeared overnight, abandoning a war that no longer paid them enough to die for. But the vacuum did not last long. Schultz replaced him with a new enforcer, a man named Ulysses Rollins, colder, quieter, and far more surgical than Bub had ever been. Rollins came to Harlem with one goal and one goal only: kill Bumpy Johnson. Unlike the others, Rollins did not rush, did not threaten, did not announce himself. He waited, and that patience made him dangerous. The collision between them finally came one summer night when Bumpy was walking a woman home after dinner, relaxed for the first time in weeks, unaware that death was already moving toward him. Rollins stepped out of the darkness and charged with a knife, the blade flashing under streetlight as the two men crashed to the pavement. There were no words exchanged, no time for fear, only instinct and violence as they rolled through the dirt fighting for leverage. When it ended, Bumpy stood up calmly, adjusted his tie, and walked away. Rollins lay behind him screaming, his face slashed open, blood pouring down his body, one eye nearly torn from its socket and hanging by the ligaments. The message was clear. Harlem was not easy ground, But Rollins survived, and survival made him reckless. Still bleeding, still bandaged, he hunted Bumpy through the night like a wounded animal. When he finally found him inside a restaurant on 125th Street, Rollins did not hesitate. He pulled his gun and fired point blank at Bumpy's head. The bullet missed by inches, tearing through Bumpy's hat instead, but it did not miss its mark. It struck an innocent woman nearby, killing her instantly. The room erupted in chaos, and in that moment, something irreversible happened. Harlem saw the true cost of Schultz's invasion. Rollins was arrested that night and sentenced to prison, but the damage had already been done. Blood had spilled where it never should have, and innocence had been sacrificed in a war that was never meant for civilians. Bumpy survived again, but survival came with clarity. Schultz could not be reasoned with, could not be contained, and as long as he lived, Harlem would never be safe. From that moment forward, Dutch Schultz was no longer just an enemy. He was a target, marked for death not by rage, but by necessity. Because in wars like this, mercy is mistaken for weakness, and hesitation is paid for in lives that have nothing to do with the fight. Harlem had crossed the point of no return, and the streets knew it. When the streets of Harlem began costing Dutch Schultz more men than they were worth, the war finally climbed high enough to reach someone who did not fight in alleys or stairwells, but across tables and continents. Lucky Luciano, the architect of modern organized crime, the man who turned chaos into structure, listened carefully as word reached him that a black gangster in Harlem was bleeding one of his most dangerous lieutenants dry. Luciano understood something Schultz never did. Violence without strategy is noise, and noise attracts attention. When Bumpy Johnson was summoned to meet him, he did not arrive trembling or posturing because fear had already been burned out of him by years of war. He came with facts, boundaries, and the quiet confidence of a man who had already survived what others could not. The meeting was not loud, not hostile, not dramatic. It was calm, measured, and lethal in its implications. Luciano listened as Bumpy explained that the war in Harlem would not end with intimidation, and that any attempt to seize the numbers game outright would be met with resistance that would never truly stop. Luciano laughed at first, amused by the idea that one man could threaten an empire. But Bumpy smiled back, reminding him that Schultz had laughed too, and Schultz was already losing. Bumpy did not ask for permission, and he did not beg for mercy. He offered a solution. Harlem would remain autonomous. The existing black lottery operators would be left untouched. No new operations would open without mafia involvement, and in return, the streets would quiet, the blood would stop, and business would stabilize. Luciano leaned back, studying him the way a chess player studies a board they did not expect to be challenged on. He reminded Bumpy that he could have him killed and take everything by force. Bumpy did not argue. He simply replied that Luciano was too intelligent a businessman to do something so inefficient. That was the moment the tone changed. Respect entered the room, not because it was granted, but because it was unavoidable. The conversation shifted from threats to calculations, from dominance to balance. When Luciano asked Bumpy how far ahead he planned, Bumpy answered without hesitation, 4 or 5 moves. Not because he enjoyed strategy, but because survival demanded it. By the time the meeting ended, an agreement had been reached that no one outside that room would fully understand. Harlem would remain Harlem. The mafia would be contained, and Bumpy Johnson would stand as the sole intermediary between black operators and the most powerful criminal organization in America. It was not submission. It was coexistence on negotiated terms. When word spread, the streets reacted immediately. Doors opened. Drinks were poured. Enemies softened their tone. Italian gangsters honored the deal not out of loyalty, but out of recognition that breaking it would be costly. Bumpy had done something no one thought possible. He had faced the devil of organized crime and walked away without kneeling, not by raising his voice, not by firing a gun, but by proving that intelligence, patience, and leverage could bend even the strongest systems. In Harlem, that mattered more than bullets. After surviving wars with the Mafia and negotiating with men who ruled empires, Bumpy Johnson made the mistake that has destroyed more powerful men than bullets ever could. He trusted someone he loved. Flash Walker entered Bumpy's life quietly, a young orphan with nothing to his name but charm, hunger, and an ability to make people feel seen. Bumpy saw himself in the boy, not as he was, but as he might have been in a different world, and that recognition opened a door no enemy had ever forced open. Flash was welcomed into Bumpy's home, trusted around his wife, treated like a son he never had, and given opportunities men twice his age would have killed for. He learned the business from the inside, watched meetings meant only for trusted men, and enjoyed protection that made him untouchable on Harlem's streets. When Flash began skimming money by cashing stolen checks through Bumpy's accounts, it hurt, but it was forgivable. Money could be replaced, loyalty could be repaired. Bumpy believed discipline and distance would be enough. But then came the moment that changed everything. One evening, Bumpy's daughter stood before him and spoke words that froze the room. Flash had touched her. Not accidentally, not jokingly, deliberately. And when her sister confirmed it, something inside Bumpy broke that no negotiation could mend. This was not business. This was not betrayal of trust alone. This was violation. Bumpy did not call a meeting. He did not ask questions. He went looking for Flash himself. When he found him, there were no words exchanged, only fists. Rage poured out of him in blows that left Flash's face unrecognizable. A public beating that stripped him not just of dignity, but of safety. Bumpy spared his life, but mercy born from lingering affection became his most dangerous mistake. His friends warned him. They told him humiliation creates enemies more patient than fear ever could. Flash knew too much, had seen too much, and men like that do not disappear quietly. While Bumpy believed the chapter was closed, Flash was planning. Hurt turned to hatred. Shame turned to revenge. He conspired with an ex-girlfriend to plant heroin in Bumpy's home, a substance Bumpy had never trafficked and openly despised. Then came the call to the police. When agents arrived, they didn't come for questions, they came with a plan. Flash had already spoken, lied, painted Bumpy as a drug dealer to save himself. Even the narcotics officers doubted the story because Bumpy's name had never surfaced in the drug trade. But the federal government saw something else, an opportunity. They didn't need truth. They needed leverage. Bumpy was arrested, humiliated, and dragged into a system that had been waiting decades to cage a man like him. During the trial, pressure came from every direction. Give us names. Trade loyalty for freedom. Clean up Harlem for us. Bumpy refused every offer. Silence was his final act of defiance. When the verdict came back guilty, even his lawyer was stunned. 15 years. A sentence meant not just to punish, but to erase. Bumpy Johnson was sent to Alcatraz, a prison designed to break men into numbers, where names meant nothing and escape meant death. The war he had survived with strategy and violence had finally claimed him through betrayal, not from the Mafia, not from the streets, but from the one place he lowered his guard, his own home. Alcatraz was designed to erase men, not just imprison them, and when Bumpy Johnson arrived, he was stripped of his name, his status, and his history, reduced to a number meant to remind him that power meant nothing behind concrete and steel. Yet even there, stories followed him, whispered between cells, carried by guards who had heard who he was before he ever set foot on the island. They said he kept to himself, read constantly, played chess, and never begged, never complained, never broke. They said he once saved a powerful man's life in the prison yard, shoving an attacker away without hesitation, not for reward, but because survival had taught him when to act. Years passed slowly, marked by isolation, silence, and the weight of betrayal that never fully faded. When Bumpy was finally released on parole in 1963, the world he stepped back into barely resembled the one he had left. Harlem had changed, power structures had shifted, and the streets were ruled by new systems and younger men. But when his car rolled through the neighborhood, something extraordinary happened. People poured into the streets. They clapped, waved, threw confetti, and cried openly as if welcoming home a president rather than a convicted felon. Bumpy stood up in the car, tears in his eyes, waving back at a community that had not forgotten what he had represented to them. To Harlem, he was not defined by court records or prison sentences. He was remembered as the man who stood between them and exploitation, the man who forced respect where none was offered freely. But time does not grant favors, even to legends. His health began to fail, his heart weakened by years of stress, confinement, and violence carried silently inside him. By the late 1960s, the man who had survived bullets, blades, and betrayal could no longer outrun his own body. On July 7, 1968, while sitting down to eat at a restaurant in Harlem, Bumpy Johnson suffered a fatal heart attack. He was 62 years old. His death shocked the neighborhood, not because it was violent, but because it was ordinary, almost peaceful, a quiet ending to a life defined by constant tension. Hundreds gathered to pay their respects, mourning a man whose story refused to fit neatly into moral categories. Some called him a gangster. Others called him a protector. Many called him a symbol. He was a criminal who helped the poor, a strategist who rejected submission, a man who enforced brutal rules while shielding his community from worse forces. He spent 26 years of his life behind bars, survived more assassination attempts than most soldiers see battles, and stood toe-to-toe with the most powerful crime syndicates in American history. Harlem did not remember him as perfect, but it remembered him as theirs. A man born into segregation who refused to live on his knees. A man who proved that intelligence could rival violence and that dignity could exist even in the darkest corners of power. In the end, Bumpy Johnson was more than a gangster. He was a reminder that history is not only written by those who win cleanly, but by those who fight to exist in systems designed to erase them. And long after his death, Harlem still whispers his name, not in fear, but in recognition.